What is a secret that your family, friends didn't want you to know? Story 1. For me it's a friend's dad. He left the family when my friend was young but would occasionally send a gift or card. My friend got a Facebook message one day from a woman who had been doing ancestry research. It turns out the dad had done the same thing, get married, have kids, bail, several times, and my friend has a crap load of half-siblings he never knew about. They're all friends now. Story 2. Long after my dad died, my mom finally admitted to us that he was always just the second option, and the man she visited often with us, and without our dad, during holidays was actually the love of her life. But he had a wife and kids, and my mom had our dad as husband and us. So they never got themselves. This man later moved to the US, and died there in a car accident. Story 3. I got so many half-siblings out there I have to cross-reference my Tinder matches with my 23andMe data. Story 4. My family never talked about my grandfather. I knew he died before I was born, but that was it. When I was about 15 my mother told me he was a terrible man, used to beat my father and their entire family. Eventually, he tried to axe murder my dad at his work, and somehow my dad fought him off. Next attempt my grandfather waited with a shotgun to kill my dad when she showed up for work, but my dad was off for some reason. Grandpa eventually got tired of waiting and just killed himself. Apparently my dad just never wanted us to know just how bad life can be, and did everything to keep that buried. Story 5. My grandmother was the child of R***. Her older brother forced his younger sister and she was the result. Despite it all, she was smarter than AF** Whip. Nobody could beat her in chess or Scrabble. Biggest heart. To hear that and then hear how her family hated her for being born. One story that stuck with me is when she was young, she got in an accident sledding. She got a large gash on her head and her grandparents, wanted her to die, so they let her bleed and bleed. She survived and fixed herself up at the age of 8. Her grandfather, then continued to R*** her until she moved out. My grandma had the worst and hardest life growing up, but she never let that make her ugly. She had 200 plus people go to her funeral and all of them called her auntie, because she took care of all the kids that got dumped by their alcoholic parents. She once said she was taking care of 20 kids at some point at the age of 15. Only respect and love for my grandma. Hard life but man, one of a kind woman. Edit. My grandma was always humble in her kindness. Never once told anyone if she gave someone money, helped them recover from drugs by giving them a home, taking in all stray animals, and loving and only encouraging others. She never had a bad thing to say about anyone. Even the worst of people, she'd say, they are hurting. Someone needs to remind them someone loves them. She'd be very bashful and red-faced hearing these kind comments. She had a hard time taking compliments and praise, but it always meant the world to her. I'm sure she's thanking all of you for being very sweet. Story 6. I learned a bunch of stuff about my grandfather after he died. He was a bootlegger, running whiskey from Canada down the coast into New England. He was an arsonist, burning down several buildings owned by people he had grudges against. He eloped at 16, had several kids, then completely bailed on that family a couple years later. Story 7. My parents had a son before me. Neither one ever talked about him. In fact, nobody in my entire extended family, uncles, aunts, grandparents, ever mentioned him. I was adored and doted on. It was a happy, loving childhood. When I was 21, I found a box with old photos and saw my parents with a kid, asking my mum who it was. She simply looked at it and said that was her son. It came as quite a shock. When I tried to press for more info, she simply told me he died when he was 3. I wanted to know how, what, and when, but she stopped me in my tracks and he's never been brought up again. Edit to address some of the comments. I know that his passing was a result of an accident that took place whilst he was playing. I don't think it's my place to know all the details. He was born a decade before me, so even though I sometimes feel sad when I remember that he existed, I've never felt the need to grieve his loss because I never really knew him. If anything, my parents overcompensated with gifts, affection, and their time when I was growing up, so nothing ever felt off to me. I believe in letting bygones be bygones, and some mysteries are best left unsolved. Story 8. My maternal grandmother was married to a widower who had 4 children from his previous marriage. She made him give up his kids before she married him. I guess she didn't want to take care of his children. She became pregnant with my mother, and when my mother was about 5 years old, her parents, my grandparents, got divorced. He just couldn't live with my cold-hearted grandmother any longer. My mother didn't tell me that. I found out by coincidence that I had 4 uncles. Story 9. My mom used to strip. No one will admit it. My dad got drunk once and let it slip out about the club she worked at when he met her. I'm fairly sure she did a porn or 2. I hope to never stumble upon it. Edit. This blew up. Just letting all while know, I'm a chick. Yes I know. Shocking. Story 10. That the man stalking me, my mom for the first 12 years of my life, was my biological father, and that he was an incredibly violent paranoid schizophrenic who had almost killed my mum. They only told me because I went for a walk with my friend around the neighborhood without telling my parents for the first time, and they lost their minds thinking my bio dad had gotten a hold of me. Story 11. When I was 17 I found out that my dad wasn't actually my biological dad. My mother had an affair and got pregnant. My parents knew I wasn't my father's child and decided to keep it a secret from me and my mother's side of the family. I grew up with 2 older and 1 younger sibling who turned out to be my half-siblings. I was treated differently my entire life, and when I found out I was an affair baby, I felt instant relief. I knew my whole life something was wrong within my family dynamic. I moved out when I was a teen. At 16, the last argument I had with my parents ended with me saying, "There's no way I'm related to you people, something must have happened at birth." Story 12. My mother treated my wife like shit during our wedding because we didn't let her host the rehearsal dinner at my wife's uncle's house, didn't let her plan any of it, and did all of the work ourselves. I only learned that she'd been dragging my wife around by the arm to try to get her to cede control of aspects of the wedding a week after the wedding. She wonders why we don't see her more than twice a year. Story 13. When I was growing up, my family would always avoid talking about my paternal grandmother. I knew she had vanished when my father was just a teenager, but that was all. No one ever spoke about her, and any questions I asked were met with uncomfortable silence or swift topic changes. It was as if she had been erased from our family history. A few years ago, I stumbled upon an old box hidden in my dad's closet. Inside, I found a stack of letters and newspaper clippings. Curiosity got the best of me, and I started reading. Turns out, my grandmother was a victim of a high-profile kidnapping when my father was 16. The kidnappers had demanded a hefty ransom, but despite my grandfather's best efforts, he couldn't raise the amount in time. The police were involved, but they never managed to find her or the kidnappers. The case eventually went cold, and my father's family was left devastated. The letters in the box were a mix of desperate pleas for help, ransom negotiations, and letters my father had written to his missing mother, pouring out his heartache and longing for her return. To this day, I have never brought it up with my dad, but now I understand why her name was never mentioned. He spent his entire life trying to forget the tragedy and keep his own children safe from the painful truth. And even though I know the secret now, I will continue to protect his wishes and keep it to myself. Story 14. When I was a little kid, I was wading around in the ocean. Suddenly my mom's boyfriend told me to come to shore, then I felt something hit my leg. It looked like you rubbed my leg with sandpaper. They said it must have been a crab, I was dumb or something and believed it. It was actually a shark. He saw it swimming towards me and that's why he told me to come to shore. They didn't want to tell me it was really a shark because they were afraid I wouldn't want to go back into the ocean. Story 15. My mom was a huge cokehead, and dealt it in clubs, too, in the 80s. Also, my siblings were actually half-siblings from her first marriage. I found out about it by eavesdropping when I was younger, but it wasn't until I was 27 that my mom, due to a long story, had to acknowledge that my dad was her second marriage. I've seen the court documents from her divorce, including those from a drug counselor, about her being huge into cocaine, but she still insists she doesn't even know what it was and feigns ignorance about anything drug-related, down to pretending not to know how to pronounce the words cocaine or marijuana. Story 16. Oh, I've got one. I found out in my mid-30s that prior to marrying my father, my mum was a prostitute, confidence trickster and arsonist. Seriously, she was a prostitute who was recruited in 1952 by a con man to build people out of their investment capital in a "we can turn black and white photographic negatives into color photographs. We just need capital to develop the machinery" scheme. Investors were shown negatives, black and white photographs, and color photos from the same negatives. It didn't occur to them these were merely colorized black and white photos. When the investors gathered to see the wonder they had created, the entire building, the machinery and all the plans went up in flames. The con man was promptly arrested. So was my mum. She agreed to testify against him in exchange for misdemeanor charges. Story 17. I found my mom's diary when I was 16. I didn't mean to snoop. I was looking through a bin of old family photos and found it. By the time I realized what it was, I couldn't stop reading. It was the diary she kept when I was 3 when she was in the psych ward after trying to kill herself. That was the first time I went into foster care. The diary was dark and trauma-laced and she was clearly experiencing psychosis. I still have the diary tucked away almost 15 years later. I never told her that I found it. Story 18. When I was 5 my sister and I got kittens one spring day. It was the happiest day of my little life up till then. Then one day a few months later he never came home. I was devastated and heartbroken. I thought he ran away and didn't love me anymore. After he had been gone a week, my sister, grandfather and I were going to the corner store. When we crossed the street I saw a flattened patch of black and white fur. They told me it was a skunk and I believed it for 20 years. Finally they told me that my little kitty when I was about 25. Rip Lil Tarzan. Story 19. Before she died mom confessed to me that she was 7 weeks pregnant with me when she got married. I told her I had done that math decades ago. Story 20. One of my best friends growing up had a purr for a father, Mr. Westport, name change. In elementary school we took a week-long trip to another state. A number of parents were chaperones including my own dad. Well apparently Mr. Westport and one of the moms were getting a little tipsy in their room and while getting handsy with the mom, also inappropriately touched her 10-year-old daughter. I don't know if the daughter spilled the beans to the teacher or if the mom maid came forward, but Mr. Westport was ostracized in the community and barred from attending school events, for good reason. Mr. Westport was successful in his career and had a penchant for going away on business trips. On one of the trips, he was scuba diving and never came up. Body never found. Lost at sea. It's believed that he may have faked his death and stayed overseas. This was back in the 90s. Story 21. My maternal grandmother, who had Parkinson's and was going to need a nursing home soon, killed herself, at 68, when I was 18. Everybody just acted like it was natural causes for a long time before admitting they had known it. They had no reason to protect me because I had already dealt with my father killing himself when I was 9, along with other sudden deaths in the family. Maybe they didn't want to deal with it themselves. Story 22. My grandfather was a pilot and it was well known he had a second wife in Australia, and I have distant cousins because of it. My grandma didn't shy away from this fact and kinda even romanticized my grandpa, who died way before I was born, was a traveling Don Juan. When my grandma passed away I had the job of going through piles and piles of papers. She was kinda a hoarder, most of the stuff were bills, newspapers, and junk mail. But I found love letters from a guy in Hong Kong with photos of my grandma and this man. The letters were so deeply moving and touching. Their love was so passionate. I was able to piece together that my grandma was so distraught for my grandpa's infidelity that she went to live with her lover for about a year. When she decided to leave and return back home, his letter goodbye was heart-wrenching. Then I pieced together that my dad's birth date was about 6 months after grandma left Hong Kong. Thank you for watching.